Yalimada, everyone, and welcome to this week's Critical Conversation. My name is Zoya Waliani, and I'm moderating today's session featuring Dr. Parin Dossa. Critical Conversations is a virtual forum on faith-based perspectives, addressing the important questions of our time. This is our fourth iteration. Quick note before we start, we are changing the time of Critical Conversations. Moving forward, they will be at this time, 1 p.m. Eastern. Here's the breakdown for today. I'll be giving a quick introduction, then Dr. Dossa will give a presentation of about 30 minutes. After that, we'll do question and answer. If you have questions for Dr. Dossa during her presentation, please feel free to put them in the chat box and I'll ask them for you during the Q&A session. Today, we are joined by members of the Jamaat and interfaith family members from both Canada and the US. Thank you to ITREB for hosting this series that allows so many of us to come together virtually at a time when we are unable to be together physically. Due to the ongoing coronavirus health crisis, we're experiencing an unprecedented time in our lives and going through difficulties. We're all undergoing a lot of anxiety and we're feeling uncertain about the future. We are here at this tough time to provide support to the Jamaat and make sure everyone knows that they are not alone. And as with any kind of widespread crisis, whether it be a pandemic or otherwise, some are struggling more than others. Those of us at the margins of society because of race, gender, social class, sexuality, ability, or age often experience crises in different and more complicated ways. By thinking of how folks different from us are affected by crises, we can begin to build and expand empathy and compassion for different segments of our community and understand how we can better support each other. In times of crisis, people tend to go into a protective mode to ensure the security of their families above all else. Historically, women have played a pivotal role in protecting the family. That's why today we will be taking a look at the different ways gender identity can impact how we experience a crisis, with a focus on women. One of the main ways that women negotiate crises is through the labor they undertake to keep their families secure. This specific type of labor is known as reproductive labor. Reproductive labor is the everyday tasks involved in staying alive and helping others to stay alive, which have traditionally been performed by women for low or no wages. In addition to being unpaid, this type of work is often uncounted in societal understandings of work and labor. This work encompasses childcare, healthcare, cleaning, shopping, bearing children, and caring for parents or other elderly family members. In this specific crisis, we are being asked to stay at home and forego the support systems we had in the past to manage our families' daily lives. Restaurants, schools, and daycares, among others. The result is an increased emphasis on reproductive labor that many women must bear, and without added support systems. Moreover, many women also have jobs outside of the care they provide for their families, which requires them to work all day and then come home from their day jobs and complete their reproductive labor. This is known as the double day or the second shift. Now that the boundaries of work and home are blending because of shelter-in-place requirements, many women are having to handle both types of work at the same time. Some women have to take leave from work in order to care for their families, which could affect their earning potentials in the future. These examples are some of the different ways women are dealing with the fallout from the COVID-19 crisis. Of course, not all women have this experience. Women are a heterogeneous group, and single mothers, lower income women, women who have multiple care responsibilities, or elderly women, for example, will have different experiences than women who may have a higher socioeconomic status, have extra help, and so on. And of course, many women experience several of these different identities at once, and this changes how they are treated by the world. This concept is known as intersectionality. It's important to keep in mind the realities of different women when considering what they have to undergo during crisis. Our speaker today is someone who has a deep understanding of how women navigate crises. Dr. Dossa is a professor of anthropology and associate member in the Department of Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies at Simon Fraser University. She's a pioneer in the field of academia, both in terms of her research and as a woman academic. Dr. Dossa's fieldwork on Muslim women in the diaspora focuses on such topics as memory, migration, social inequality, gender and health, aging, structural violence, and storytelling. Some of her fieldwork includes her work in Afghanistan, where she examined Afghan women's recall of violence through memories and food practices in their homeland and its diaspora. Another study she conducted on migration and storytelling looks at the ways systemic inequality impacted the health and well-being of recently settled Canadian Iranian women. Dr. Dossa has made a massive impact in the field of academia with regards to the effects of crisis on women, and we're really lucky to have her with us here today. Thank you for being here, Dr. Dossa, and now I'll turn it over to you.
Yalimatad, everybody. Thank you, Zoya. You have encapsulated the main points very well, and it allows me to move forward. So what I want to emphasize to begin with is that this is a collaborative endeavor. And I would like you to share your experiences, your stories, because it is critical that we reflect on the crisis and its aftermath. Also, it is important that we highlight a faith-based framework. The reason why I state this is that we need to look at alternative ways of being in the world, alternative ways of dealing with the crisis. And the main issue that I would like to emphasize today, based on my research, is the need for solidifying intergenerational relationships and the need on the part of the women to establish connections. So let us look at COVID-19 crisis for a moment. I would say that there are two scripts embedded in this particular crisis. The first script is what is covered in the media. And we are bombarded with figures and the number of people who are dying very sadly, people who are affected in a way whereby they don't necessarily have access to the healthcare system. So this is the larger script. The second script that I want to highlight is what can women do? And this particular perspective would allow us to look at the local scenarios, the networks that we can build. Now, moving on from what Zoya highlighted, that women's lives are very complex. There is a paradigm of intersectionality, women's heterogeneous positionality in society are important considerations. But what we need to look at is the resilience, the courage, and the resourcefulness that women have. But this will never, ever be materialized fully unless and until we come together. And here, I want to highlight the lives of older people who have, by and large, been socially marginalized. They have been rendered redundant in our societies. They are considered as a service population, but we never ever take into account that the relationship between the two generations of women, and it does not exclude the forthcoming generation, should actually be based on mutual understanding, mutual care. So I hear that there are a lot of children who leave food outside the doors of their elderly parents if they are living in a separate household. So one example that I have is, in the process of doing that, maybe ask your mother to leave a story of her life that we have not actually had the opportunity, the space, or the time to listen to. Now, I do not want to talk in abstract terms. So what I'm going to do is I'm very quickly going to go through a vignette that I have included in my work. I think this vignette is important because it highlights the rupture that exists. And if we do want to come together, we need to actually narrow the gap between generations. But let me just go through this vignette. It is actually about food, and it's symbolic. We know that it has symbolic, social, cultural, and spiritual significance. But in this particular case, we can kind of, relate to it. It resonates with us. So the item that I want to talk about is rotis, or we can say naan for the Jamaat in Central Asia. So this, if the rotis were to speak, this is what they would have to say. There was a time when I had a place on a table full of people and a presence as part of food dishes, especially my companion, the curry. It gave me a good feeling that I satisfied so many people. Now that I have crossed the border into another country, my use is limited to once or twice in a week. My pan sits alone in the corner of a kitchen shelf. It is no longer included in the everyday activities that take place in the kitchen. I feel good when occasionally my nurturer uses me to make 20 rotis that are distributed to her children. They take me to their homes, but they do not consume me right away when I am fresh. They put me in the freezer, an unpleasant experience that I never had before. When they are ready to include me in their meal, they put me in a microwave. So freezing cold to very hot in a matter of minutes. I leave it to your imagination as to what this process is like, given that it occurs in minutes. When the parents eat alone, I feel their loneliness. They do not enjoy me as much as when the children are not present. I am no longer whole as I once was. I can express myself in language only because of my experience of rupture. I no longer exist in a house full of people who would relish me. My experience of being frozen, alone and isolated, enables me to put into words my feeling of being cut off from the world that I once knew intimately. So what the rotis are engaged in doing is bemoaning the loss of social relationships. Now, I am not suggesting that we can go back to the past and actually recreate the social networks that we had, with, not only with family, but with neighbors, with peers, with co-workers. But my particular point in that I want to convey through this rotis is that we need to build relationships. We need to be interconnected in whatever way we can. It could also be done in small spaces. And anthropologists will tell you that the small spaces where we connect are significant. They cannot be dismissed. Only then women intergenerationally will be able to realize their potential. Now, the reason why I want to highlight the aspect of bringing in, including older people, is that they have a repertoire of knowledge. First of all, as Shakespeare mentioned, that we know more by virtue of the fact that we have lived long. Also, older women have crossed borders. Now, this border crossing knowledge is vital because it takes us to our ancestral roots. It allows us to hear their stories of struggles, of triumphs and tribulations. And so it enriches our lives. Furthermore, older people actually use metaphors much more extensively because they have the time and the space that is not available to younger women because of the fact that they have busy lives. And also, very importantly, we need to note that we are living in a world that is encompassed by a global capitalism. Now, global capitalism is not just an economic system. It's also a cultural system. It promotes individualism, self-care, self-independence that is not viable in a situation of crisis and even beyond that. So I have a PowerPoint on stories. This is written in Gujarati. So if you can have that PowerPoint on stories, that just want to share with you very quickly.
1 second, I'll pull that up.
It's okay, we can see it later. This is a story. This PowerPoint is a story that is written by an elderly woman. And the reason why I put this in the PowerPoint is that I want also to bring home the importance of language. I'm not suggesting that we learn Gujarati. I mean, there are multiple languages that we have access to as Muslims. But I just want to bring to light that these stories do not just remain within a discrete space. The stories, in fact, contain a larger narrative. And the narrative is that of how can we recognize that my story is your story. This is one way in which we can establish interconnections and solidarity. And this particular story struck me because I think it also reflects a kind of a calligraphic writing. And, you know, in terms of language, I'm going to talk about it a little bit more because I think that stories and sacred traditions that I will refer to just in a moment. We can now let the PowerPoint go. Zoya, it's okay, thank you. So what I want to show is that stories and sacred traditions, in fact, bring to light aspects of emotion, of affect, of memory work that is not contained in the language. So when when I talk about deep level conversations in my forthcoming book on social palliation, I emphasize the point that conversations that just stay at the level of discourse, though they are valuable, they do not capture who we are as persons who are living fragile and finite lives. what does it mean when we recognize that our humanity is compromised by larger forces? And so the power of stories cannot be overemphasized in terms of highlighting not just discourse and language that can be very dry, but including metaphors and including musicality of sacred traditions. So what I want to do is I want to quickly cite Rumi's verse and that of Sadi of Shirazi, just to make my point that how we also need to relate to this level, because these are the sources that actually give us solace in the time of crisis. So let us see what Rumi has to say. He says, "Raise your words, not voice. It is rain that grows flowers, not thunder." And then again, Rumi says, "Use a different language and the world will be a new one." And Sadi of Shirazi, he says, "A raindrop dripping from a cloud, ashamed when it saw the sea. Who am I? Where is the sea?" It said, as it saw itself from the eyes of humility, a shell embraced it and made him a pearl. I think in today's world, we would say him, her. This was different times. So what I want to point out is that the sacred traditions, they include the existential questions, who we are, living lives that are finite and fragile. And a quick discussion on these sacred traditions also should make us realize that as we go about establishing networks, however small they may be, we must also strive to be part of the larger society. And I think this is very critical, because the time has come when we should feel, bold and courageous to highlight our traditions, our culture. After all, we need to recall that we have a faith that is 1,400 years old, and that we have culture, we have civilization, we have scholarship, we have art, we have philosophy, we have writings on ethics of care. And so my point is, taking pride in our traditions, in our culture, and I think women are best positioned to do that because of their ability to establish these interconnections. And in doing so, we can then present an alternative narrative, an alternative way of being in the world to the outside world, not only to each other. I always take the example of First Nations communities, indigenous people. When I teach, I never ever start my course without including First Nations people. The reason being that they are exemplary in terms of providing an illustration of what we can achieve if we work together, what we can achieve if we acknowledge the lives of older women. So what I will do now, I know that there are quite a few questions. So what I want to do is very quickly go through my slides from Afghanistan. So Afghanistan remembers, and this will not take too long. So, so I want to actually point to this slide because the work that is done in Afghanistan right now is carried out by women. When Afghanistan was subject to war and conflict, it was as a result of the larger narrative, because the Cold War was fought on its soil. But this is the narrative that has been forgotten by the media. So who remembers? Women. They actually, through memory work and through food, they highlight this larger narrative that it's not that Afghanistan is in this era. It's not that there's all this conflict is confined within the boundaries of the nation state of Afghanistan, but actually Afghanistan was subject to this war that was waged by outside powers, and this is the narrative that women want to foreground. Can we move on to the second slide? So I'm also trying to, I've included Canada because I'm trying to establish a connection by, through the diasporic medium. But there is a connection between Canada and Afghanistan, not in the sense of one country helping the other, but connection that the two countries are actually interrelated in terms of, what it is like to be human in this day and age. Can we move on? I'm just going to go through this quickly. So this is Scenic Afghanistan. It's very beautiful. This is militarization. Let's move on. So these are the prairies, the pristine, scenic Canadian Rockies. Now the two are interconnected, but we do not establish that connection, as Edward Said expressed it very well in his work on Orientalism. Let's move on, please. So this is the, we are having chai. My daughter and myself, we are having chai. And one point that I think I want to emphasize here is women's work, hospitality and respect and mutual care. And so they have laid out a spread which is actually quite diminished from their own culture, whereby they would have a larger spread. So they would have a variety of fruits, variety of nuts, and dried fruit. But here it's laid out decoratively, but it's just apples, raisins, chickpeas, and maybe some cookies. But still, despite of war and violence within the country, women are carrying on the work of hospitality. Move on, please. So this is the extended family. And you can see the, elderly woman. She is given a central space, given importance. And I'm not saying that we can recreate such families, but interconnectivity and solidarity is the emphasis that I would like to actually highlight. Next one, please. So we talked about stories. This is my favorite picture. I have a story to share. When I look at her face, I can tell that every single line on her face has a story. And this is what I meant, but how stories can enrich our lives and what kind of stories she must have shared with her family is an area that I could not go into as a researcher. Next one. This one is also, I have a story to share, and this is in Canada. Again, border crossing story. Next one, I want to go through this quickly to leave time for questions. So what I want to highlight here is the barbed wire. That is very common in Afghanistan because of security. Next one, please. And this is I would call this the barbed wire, or a gated community or a gated house in Canada. And this is what we have taken to. And this is my point, that, if we live behind these barbed wired homes, then how are we going to go about establishing connections? So here the point is more symbolic than anything else. We should not, as women, we should not be building walls and borders. We should be breaking these walls and borders wherever we see them exist, so that we can come up with creative solutions and then move forward. Next one. So this is the enactment of violence. These are the scenes that I encountered, while I was there. Next one. So this is the future. These are the girls who have been sent to school by their mothers, overcoming opposition, ensuring that their children have education so that their lives would be better. So this is, I wanted to share with you this particular PowerPoint on Afghanistan. This is the end. And so what the women are doing is, first of all, they are establishing the connection between the third world and the third world in inverted commas, or global south and global north, which is the west. And they are making the point that there is a connection, and this connection is established through the diaspora. Second, in their everyday lives, women are engaged in rebuilding their communities, rebuilding their networks, not in the way that existed in the past. So let me give you an example. A lot of families had gardens which were destroyed during the war and conflict. And now what they have is a vegetable patch. And one of my chapters is titled, the fire in the hearth will be diminished, but it will not be extinguished. What it means is a symbolic reminder again of women's work, that they do not allow the fire to die down. They continue to let it burn. It is diminished. It can never have the full strength that it had before because of war and conflict. But still, I would go to the home of an Afghan family, and I would be served chai, because the fire was burning. Another expression of hospitality. But symbolically, it just kind of brings home the point, and it should also be a good example for us that women have the resilience, they have the courage, and we can rebuild our lives, provided we do not fall into the trap of being too individualistic. We need to move out of that mold. We need to move out of these barriers and walls that exist. They may be physical, or they may be social, or they may be cultural. But in doing so, we would be enriching our families, and we would also be connecting with the outside world. Sometimes it is a concern that, our opportunity to interact with mainstream populations sometimes is limited just to the place of work, or in the realm of health services, or in the realm of social services. But we need to really establish those genuine friendships that I think would be more fruitful. So I think I'm going to now just summarize. So I have kind of highlighted the importance of a new language, citing Rumi, that if you use a new language, it will be a new world. I want to highlight the importance of stories. We tell stories to each other. And in doing so, the stories invite us to witness each other's stories. So I move into your space through storytelling, and you move into my space. And then what happens? We establish a platform of connectivity, but we also recognize our vulnerabilities. We recognize that we are going through hard times. And then we start exploring pathways that would be enriching. And I want to highlight the point that even if these pathways are tiny, even if you don't think they are significant, they do matter, because they can lead to larger projects. And the other aspect that I want to emphasize is that of giving center space to elderly people. And absolutely, there is no doubt that in the society at large, they have been marginalized. They have been socially marginalized. And it is ironical that they have the wealth of knowledge. They can provide us with solace. They actually are apt in using metaphors and musicality of sacred traditions, as I would put it. And yet we are not tapping into that resource. Our relationship with older people is very linear. We help them, but we don't see how they can enrich our lives. And our help also just remains at the level of what I call utilitarian aspect. That means, so do you need some food? Do you need some groceries? That's very utilitarian, because we don't really probe and look at the reservoir of knowledge that they embody. So ultimately, we need to ask the question, what it is like to be human, not only in relation to other human beings, but being on the planet Earth, in relationship to nature, in relationship to other species. The second question that we want to ask is, what are the forces that compromise our humanity? The third issue that we want to consider is, how can we draw upon our rich tradition of faith so that we gain strength and we gain solace, and that would allow us to establish connections. And we need to recognize that our lives are finite and fragile. There is uncertainty of life, but there is certainty of death. This is one of the aspects that all human beings have to come into terms with. But again, I want to emphasize that the points that I have made would really resonate with the lives of the women because of their positionality, of taking care of families, in every way, culturally, not only in terms of physical care, but culturally, symbolically, socially, and also because of their role in society. They are the bearers of cultures and religious traditions. So I guess I will stop now, because you might have questions.
That was great. Thank you so much. I think the audience really enjoyed that. We're getting a lot of positive feedback and good questions. Just one quick question from the audience, a clarifying question. The sacred traditions that you mentioned, is this referring to cultural traditions or Islamic traditions?
I think it could be both. I think we need to open up, and we need to recognize that all communities have sacred traditions, and they may be subjugated in a secular society. So I would never ever advocate us remaining confined to just our tradition. I think it's time, as human beings being faced with this crisis, that we open up the boundaries.
Great, thank you. So one thing that kind of resonated with me, and I think with some of the audience, is this concept of our younger generation needing to really take stock of the experiences of the older generation and not just provide that material assistance, but also learn more about their experiences so that we can, take those lessons for ourselves. So, what I want to ask is, what can the younger generation do to ensure that we are listening to and learning from the experiences of the older members of our community, some constructive ways that we can do that?
I think one particular way that has been proved to be viable is stories. They have stories to tell. So I think, and they might not want to, tell a story in one sitting. I think there's some patience required. It could be in bits and pieces. That would be one aspect. The other aspect is looking at their everyday lives. I think the importance of everyday life cannot be overemphasized. A lot of significant events take place in the context of everyday life. So look at their everyday lives, and in terms of whether they tap into certain kind of knowledge to which we would not have access otherwise. And the third aspect is look at their border crossing experiences. I think that every single older person who is an immigrant And in my case with my research participants, they came to Canada when they were in their 40s, and they have most of them. And so they will tell you their lives of struggles, but also how they overcome struggles. So all this would be very enriching, but I would really pay attention to metaphors and images, because those are powerful. They stay with us. And metaphors are not frozen in time. They can be evoked in particular situations.
Great, thank you. Another question that we have is, so there's a notice that in the Jamaat, older generations often have maybe different expectations of how reproductive and social labor should look as opposed to some of the younger generations. And this can occasionally lead to tension between family members, Jamaati communities, as each wants their own approach to be the one that the family or the community takes. So what can we do in our families and Jamaats to create more fruitful intergenerational dialogue in terms of how we care for ourselves, our families, and our communities?
Right. Very good question. It would be very unusual if there were no tensions. If I may cite a Gujarati saying that, "Tham hoy to khakde." If there are dishes, they're going to make noise. So I would be suspicious if there were no tensions. I thought that, somebody is giving in. But these tensions and conflicts can be resolved through deep level conversations, to really taking the time and understanding each other's point of view, but also ultimately establishing a common ground by asking, well, what are our ethical values? How do we live a life where we are empathetic, we are compassionate, so what are our moral values? And I think this is one area where conversation can take place that could resolve some of these tensions. And if the tensions are not resolved immediately, I would not give up. I would continue talking, and there is also, fortunately, there's also room for compromise.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Another topic I think is maybe, difficult for us to talk about culturally has to do with mental health. We often have, folks in our communities who are maybe experiencing depression or anxiety, and this is sort of difficult to talk about. And often it happens to the elderly members of our community. So can you speak a little bit about that and how we can encourage these members of our community who, they're mentally capable to participate in these intergenerational relationships, but might be struggling with mental health that is preventing them from wanting to really engage in these relationships fully?
Yeah, I think this is a very significant question. In fact, I address this issue in my book, Politics and Poetics of Migration. And I think that if there is a mental health issue, while the doctors can, do their part, we could actually address this in a different way. In my research with Iranian women, they use the term salamati ruh, means peace of the soul. Ruh is soul. So essentially, one of the activists in the community identified the extent of mental health that was prevalent among older people. So what she did was she formed a group of ESL classes, English as second language. And so she, in fact, invited these women to attend these classes. She ensured that she had some funding from the government. And when the women got together, they would have 1 hour of classes. And after that, they were encouraged to socialize and talk and tell their stories. This was one way in which they were able to at least confront this issue of mental health, which is really very, very significant, because when people are lonely, when people are isolated, even now, we might hear about, post-traumatic stress disorder. So we need to actually, my point is that arrange another activity, not just say, oh, come together, we're going to address the issue of mental health. That may work from the point of view of biomedicine, but beyond that, to recognize other person's humanity, we need to have an activity whereby then we encourage women, not even use the word mental health, encourage them to talk, to get together, another example of solidarity.
That's great, thank you. So I want to ask a few questions, maybe tie in the current crisis that we're looking at. So, obviously we're in this situation right now, but there will be a time where we can go back to society, we can go back to this sense of normalcy, and we're going to be pretty affected by what we had to go through. So my question is, maybe go a little bit more into what are the ways that women are affected by a crisis after it's complete, and what are some ways that you anticipate women and the older generation being affected by the COVID crisis once we're able to return to some semblance of normalcy?
Yeah, I think it will be major. I think the research shows that we will not be able to go back to normalcy because of the economic collapse and other factors having remained in isolation for so long. So I would suggest to start building networks and relationships virtually. And there are other means too from now, because I don't think we need to wait for the aftermath, because then, things would be very different and we might not have the space and the time that we have now. So I would suggest that women can form groups virtually, and they can decide whether they want to undertake cooking and their creative ways. I know there's one lady here in Vancouver who is taking orders of food, or some craft work, or any other kind of activity, or even a book club, any kind of activity that they would enjoy, so that they have a community, a small community locally. So after the crisis, they can continue to sustain this community in a manner that it would also serve at that time when people are rebuilding their lives and addressing a host of issues that will arise.
I think that's a really great point. I feel like that really speaks to kind of some of the work that you had written about in your book, Transnational Aging and Reconfigurations of Kin Work, discussing the ways that families who had been affected by migration and crisis really try to maintain those kin relationships globally. And I think that's something that really applies to our community. We have such global ties throughout the world. And now that we have technologies like video chat, Zoom, WhatsApp, it's allowing women and other people in families to really try to maintain those kin relationships. So I think that that's really helpful for us. So another question just on this topic of the aftermath of crisis, I think something that is going to be really big affecting women is the way that children will be affected by this crisis. So now we know that most public schools, I think, are closed till the end of the school year, which really means that women and maybe grandmothers and other members of families will have to be maintaining the education, the social development, the social networks of children. And that's going to be difficult for children. So maybe you can talk a bit about the ways that women are affected by children's experience of crisis, and how you think that that's going to play out here.
So I've seen a couple of websites whereby some daycare teachers and also I think also preschool teachers are forwarding activities that children can undertake. But I think what would be really significant is for women to kind of share their stories on what kind of activities the children can undertake. And of course, we are told that establishing a routine is important. balance is important, so children are then have the opportunity to engage into a variety of activities. Some women who are now at home have actually taken up homeschooling, not for the whole day, but 1 or 2 hours. So I would, if I was, confronted with this particular issue, I would talk to other women and find out what they are doing and see what is relevant, adopt what is relevant, and keep on sharing your stories about, what you can do with children, and if they are unhappy, how you can go about addressing this issue. But I think variety of activities in a routine is helpful from what I have learned, given this COVID crisis.
Absolutely. And I think also, cutting women some slack. Of course, we're not going to be able to have full days of homeschooling for children. It's, an unusual time. So I think it's important to just have some humanity for ourselves. Another question from the audience was about healthcare workers, how they, they're really the front lines of the COVID crisis. And we are aware that a disproportionate number of healthcare workers are women. So can you maybe speak to the disruption of their lives by this crisis and the different ways that they might be impacted as healthcare workers who are having to really deal with the number of, deaths and illnesses and how that can cause stress for them?
Absolutely. Healthcare workers are actually in the front line of the news, and how, the social inequality that is entrenched in societies are highlighted, the fault lines of the system, so to speak. And I think this is where activists can take up their cause in consultation with some healthcare workers, if they are able to establish contact. But I think here it is an issue of activism, and not just signing petitions, but actually bringing to light the kind of issues that they encounter. I really find it disturbing that the media just gives us figures and probably 1 or 2 observations, but and this is mainstream media, but we don't really get to know what these health workers go through, and that when they come to work, and if they are rendered vulnerable, they go home, and the fear that they might spread the virus to members of their families. So I think the issue here is that of activism, and it's really a tough one. I don't think there is at all, just one response.
Yeah, absolutely. Another question that has come up that I think is a difficult and important topic is the issue of domestic violence, especially now that, we're confined to the home. There seems to have been an increase in domestic violence. Can you speak to that in times of crisis, how that, affects the family unit and what we might see in this crisis coming from that?
I think this is a critical issue. And we need to, first of all, understand that domestic violence exists at multiple levels. It may be physical, it may be verbal, it may be just abuse in different ways, like, making the women do more work. It would be very, even if a woman is subject to oppression, that is also a form of violence. And this has been an issue that I think communities are addressing, and essentially, again, I just cannot, I do not have any other response but to reiterate the point. For women to come together and talk about their experiences and then discuss solutions. But we might need, or I think we most likely would need, someone who is not subject to these issues, who can play a leading role in bringing the women together, talking about issues. And my research in other countries has shown that it is through solidarity that women are able to overcome this form of violence. But I don't think it should be underestimated at all. And you are right. During the time of crisis, it is accentuated. And it must be addressed. And we just kind of put it under the carpet. And women who are subject to, violence, they don't want to speak up because they are worried about the children, or they were, and not being able to hold their families together if they bring these issues to light. So I think we need an activist who is aware of this particular issue and bringing women together, not under the topic of violence, but bringing women together to see what can be done to improve their lives. Again, using the term violence, some women will shy away and they will not want to participate. So just under some kind of a project that might interest them, and then encourage them to talk about the kind of violence that they encounter, and then come up with solutions.
That's great. Thank you so much. So we have a few questions about some of the things you were talking about, how we can really glean lessons from our elderly community members. And you mentioned focusing in on metaphor. Can you just talk a bit more about that and help us really understand how we can kind of glean meaning from metaphors that are coming from the stories of our elderly family members, what we can do to really engage them in metaphor?
Right. So I think what has happened in our society, given I have to come back to global capitalism, we do not use metaphors to foreground issues or to think about existential issues of life. So one example I can give is that, for example, there is this metaphor that I have come across often, is that someone who's feeling sad. So the metaphor that's used is that, look, the day has come, but now it's followed by night, but that the night is followed by day. The flowers fade, but they are going to bloom. So in the metaphor of light, for example, the day is lit by the sun, the night is lit by the moon, and your heart will be lit by love. So those kind of metaphors. But I want to emphasize that metaphors should never be allowed to remain frozen. They need to remain open, they need to remain relevant, and then they need to evoke responses. So they should be used as situations arise. But these are the examples that I can give.
That's great, thank you. I think it's such an important point that you raise in talking about the effects of global capitalism on the way that we deal in our family units. And especially, I think, just focusing in on the fact that in the West, we really do have this emphasis on individualism, self-care, less so focus on the wider community. So I think, we really need to pay attention to that. And I think this crisis is really illuminating that when we see that countries that have a tighter social system seem to be handling the COVID crisis in a more productive way than us. And so, we've got members of our communities here in the West who might not have access to those social systems. So I think this is maybe an instance where you're saying that we need to really start building those networks amongst ourselves to kind of make up for that lack of social system that we're getting from our governments. Does that seem to be what you're talking about?
Yeah, but we may be able to get some assistance from the government if we get together. But essentially, I think that the initiative should come from the grassroots level. And I want to give one example of the power that women have. In the 1960s and 70s, people who are differently able-bodied, or people who have different abilities were referred to as disabled people. Then some women got together on a kitchen table over a cup of coffee, and they had children with different abilities, and they said, why should we accept this stigmatized term? So they engaged into so much activism. It was a lot of work, but because of their work, now we never ever say disabled people. We always say persons with disabilities because they are persons first, persons with different abilities. But before these women engaged into this activist work, differently abled people were really subject to stigmatization just through this particular label. That means their identity was recognized through ability rather than them being, persons.
Right.
That's a very important point. That personhood needs to be affirmed for everybody.
Absolutely.
And needs to be acknowledged.
That's a great example. Thank you so much. Unfortunately, I think we're running out of time. There's been a pretty big request from the audience to get some resources from you on, your books that you've written, the poems that you cited today, as well as maybe some other titles of books that focus on engagement between generations. So maybe we can get that from you later and send it out to the audience if that's possible. So, I just want to quickly go over what we talked about today. It's been a very enlightening discussion. We've discussed the varied way women are affected by crisis, and we've taken note of the fact that women experience crisis differently depending on their various identities and circumstances. We've also talked about how in times of crisis, women form solidarity and build community and intergenerational relationships. So it's important for us now to start thinking about how we can support each other, both now and when this crisis comes to a close, since we know the effects of this crisis will be long-term in many ways. I want to thank you again, Dr. Dossa, for being here with us today and sharing some of your work and your thoughts on this topic. And I want to thank the audience for participating in this talk today. It's certainly a difficult topic, and it's important that we've begun this conversation here today. And we can, of course, continue it. I'll encourage everyone to join in again next Sunday at 1 p.m. Eastern for another session of Critical Conversations. The topic will be Lived Practices in Ramadan with Dr. Alnur Danani and Dr. Hussein Rashid. Thank you, and Yali Madad.
Yali Madad, and I'd like to thank Dr. Shelina Kojamulji and Fahreen Hussein for inviting me to this session. And thank you, Zoya Walani, for moderating the session very well.
Thank you so much. Have a good day, everybody.